Unbelievable moment, he caught his wife and his houseboy together. Drake had always believed in love. Not just any love, but the kind that was true, unshakable, and pure. He had spent his entire life searching for something meaningful, something that made every sacrifice worth it. When he met Helen, it seemed like the stars themselves had aligned. She was everything he had ever dreamed of, a woman full of grace, beauty, and kindness. They were a perfect match, or so he thought. They had been together for 7 years, married for 5, and their love had blossomed in ways that made the world seem right. Life hadn't always been easy, but Drake never minded the challenges. He was a hard worker, a man of integrity. He poured everything into his job, believing that hard work would ensure a bright future for him and Helen. They had a house in the suburbs, a life that many would envy, a quiet, peaceful existence. To make things easier, they employed a young man named Joe to help around the house. Joe had come into their lives 2 years ago, looking for work. He was a simple, polite young man, with a soft smile and a willingness to do whatever was needed. Helen had insisted on hiring him, believing that the house could be better managed with extra help. At first, everything seemed fine. Joe did his chores diligently, and Drake never thought much of his presence. He would come home after a long day at the office, and there Joe would be, doing the dishes or mopping the floor. But lately, Drake had noticed a subtle shift in the air, a change he couldn't quite place. It was as though something was different, and it made his heart uneasy. It was on an ordinary Tuesday that the unbearable moment came. Drake had just returned from a meeting with his business partners. He was tired, exhausted even, but he was eager to see Helen. They had plans for dinner that evening, and he was looking forward to spending time together. He pulled into the driveway of their home, feeling a sense of comfort wash over him. He had always loved the way their house looked, like a sanctuary. A place where they could be safe from the world outside. He opened the front door quietly, hoping to surprise Helen. The house was silent, the kind of silence that felt too still. As he walked down the hallway, he noticed something odd. The door to the living room was ajar. That wasn't normal. He never left doors open, especially not the one to the living room, where Helen usually sat when she read her books or watched television. With a slight frown, he moved toward the door. And then he saw them. Helen was sitting on the couch, her head resting against Joe's shoulder. His hand was gently holding hers, and they were both laughing, a sound that once would have filled Drake's heart with warmth. But now, it felt like a knife twisting in his chest. He stood frozen for a moment, unsure whether to step forward or retreat. His mind raced, his thoughts whirling in a dizzying spiral. The scene before him was like something from a nightmare, something he could never have imagined. Joe looked up first, his eyes widening in shock when he saw Drake standing there. But it was Helen who made the first move. She quickly pulled away from Joe, standing up too fast as if to put distance between them. But the damage was done. The image was burned into Drake's mind, and no matter how much he wanted to believe there was an explanation, he couldn't shake the truth. His wife and his houseboy, together, in a way that spoke of intimacy, of something far more than mere friendship. For a moment, there was only silence. The world seemed to pause, holding its breath, waiting for something, anything, to break the stillness. Drake didn't know what to say. His lips felt dry, his heart pounded in his chest. He had always trusted Helen, loved her deeply. But now, all that seemed to crumble in front of him. Helen, he whispered, his voice barely audible. He couldn't bring himself to speak louder, as though saying it out loud would make the pain real, make it worse. Drake, I can explain, Helen said, her voice trembling. She reached out to him, but he instinctively stepped back. He had never felt this distance between them before, never this coldness in her touch. No, Drake said, his voice growing stronger, though his chest ached with every word. There's no explanation. I saw everything. Helen's eyes filled with tears, but Drake couldn't bring himself to comfort her. His mind was clouded with anger, confusion, and betrayal. How could she do this to him? He had given her everything, his trust, his love, his dedication. I never meant for this to happen, Drake, Helen said, her voice breaking. Joe and we never meant to hurt you. Drake turned away from her, unable to bear the sight of her tears, of the woman he had once trusted with all his heart. He felt so lost, so broken. The house that had once felt like a home now felt cold and empty. How could something that once brought so much joy now bring so much pain? Joe remained silent, his eyes fixed on the floor. He didn't seem to know what to say either. He had always been respectful, quiet, never crossing any boundaries. But this was beyond anything Drake could have ever imagined. "I need space," Drake finally said, his voice hoarse. He didn't know if he meant the house or the relationship, but at that moment, it didn't matter. He needed to leave, to be somewhere, anywhere, that wasn't here. He walked out of the room without another word, his steps heavy and slow. The weight of everything crushed him, each step feeling like an impossible burden. His emotions were a jumble of disbelief and hurt. He had always been so sure of Helen's love. He had always been so certain that their relationship was strong. How could he have been so wrong? He spent the rest of the evening wandering through the house, pacing back and forth. His mind kept returning to that moment in the living room, the sight of Helen and Joe together, the laughter they shared, the closeness between them. It felt like a betrayal, and no matter how many times he tried to convince himself otherwise, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had been lost forever. Hours passed, and eventually, Drake found himself sitting alone in their bedroom. He didn't want to face Helen. He didn't want to hear any more excuses or justifications. The pain was too raw, too fresh. But as he sat there in the silence, a small part of him wondered if there could ever be a way forward. Could love really survive something like this? Or was this the end? As the night stretched on, he fell into a restless sleep, haunted by the images of what he had seen, of the woman he loved and the man he had trusted. The following days were a blur. Drake and Helen barely spoke. Every conversation felt like an effort, every word a reminder of the distance between them. He couldn't bring himself to look at her the same way, and Helen seemed to know that. The tension in the house was unbearable, and it felt as though they were both walking on eggshells, afraid to speak too much or say the wrong thing. Joe had left the house after that night. He didn't come back, and Drake couldn't bring himself to say goodbye. He didn't know what to say to him anyway. But in the quiet moments, when Drake was alone with his thoughts, he found himself reflecting on the love he had for Helen. Love, he had always believed, was about sacrifice and understanding. It was about patience, forgiveness, and the power of embrace. But, now, with the pieces of his heart scattered, he wasn't sure what was left of that love. Could love endure this kind of pain? Could he ever trust her again? These were the questions that kept him awake at night, searching for answers that he wasn't sure existed. And so, Drake sat alone in the house they had once filled with laughter and love, contemplating the impossible. What could he do when the love he had always believed in was shattered beyond recognition? The weight of that realization pressed heavily on him, and for the first time in his life, he truly understood the price of sacrifice, the price of love.